In my last two videos, I talked about the history of Quebec going back to its origins and tracing its development through the conquest up until the birth of Canada. Today, we get modern, and we'll be talking about the history of Quebec during the 20th century, focusing specifically on the Quiet Revolution. The Quiet Revolution is a period of dramatic change for Quebec society. The old rules were thrown out the window, and Quebec entered a period of cultural confidence it had never seen before. In many ways, it's the period that really is the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of the sovereignty movement. So, let's get started. The 1960s were, for many Western societies, a decade of changing values. The hippies, free love, and all that. For Quebec, it was, and is still, the decade where their people were, in a sense, reborn. Since the conquest in the 1760s, the British Empire and the Catholic Church had colluded, to some extent, to keep Quebecers in line. In effect, you had the Anglican British Empire tolerating the Catholic Church in their territory, as long as doing so meant supporting their hegemony, that is, their control over the region. The Catholic Church was all too happy to do so, if doing so meant tightening their own grip in Quebec and shoring up a Catholic stronghold in North America. In effect, being Catholic became both a means of defining oneself against the other, the British conqueror, and the means by which that conqueror extracted consent for his rule. Brutal. In the early 20th century, this didn't change much. Canada became more and more independent and less British, but Quebec remained pretty much as French as ever, but became more and more Catholic. Although a measure of democracy had come to Quebec, and although a strong strain of independent thought going back beyond Confederation had always existed in Quebec, elections were almost always determined by the position of the Catholic Church on whatever issue. All of this is perhaps best exemplified by the period just after the Second World War, which Quebecers in retrospect called La Grande Noirceur, or in English, the Great Darkness. Pretty ominous, right? During this time, from 1944 until 1960, every Quebec election was won by one single party, l'Union Nationale, run by Maurice Duplessis. But why is the period called the Great Darkness? It's because the government under Duplessis came to stand for two policies above all: economic liberalization and clericalism. First, let's talk about economic liberalization. Fundamentally, economic liberalization is about reducing the interference of the state in the economy, but it never really works out that way, does it? For Duplessis and l'Union Nationale, it was more about protecting the status quo, i.e. sharing of power between the state inherited from the British Empire and the Catholic Church. Duplessis was particularly worried about communism and saw his policies of economic liberalization as a means of preventing a communist takeover. The Catholic Church was also eager to stamp out any whiff of socialist thought for reasons that we'll get to shortly. A good example of this anxiety about socialism is La Loi du Quinquennat, passed in 1937. In effect, it allowed Duplessis to shut down any bar or restaurant or meeting place suspected of hosting socialist meetings for one whole year. It was, under Duplessis' heavy hand, as much a political tool as an ideological one. This gave him a lot of power, as you can imagine, to shut down businesses that might not have been necessarily communist, but which disagreed or opposed Duplessis in any way. Another very important part of economic liberalization under l'Union Nationale was, of course, making money, and Duplessis was very interested in attracting investors to Quebec. Great, cool. Who doesn't like a good investor? Well, for Duplessis, this usually meant American investors, and almost exclusively meant Anglophone investors. And it also meant defending the rights of those investors, always at the expense of Quebec workers. Take, for example, the Asbestos Strike of 1949. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Asbestos Strike of 1949. In 1949, Quebec supplied something in the territory of 85% of the world's asbestos. And people even knew back then that it caused lung problems. But hey, gotta create jobs, right? Anyways, the Asbestos Strike of 1949 took place in Thetford Mines and in the imaginatively named Asbestos, Quebec. The miners were demanding that the American owners of the mine increase their pay to $1 a day, up from 85%, that they provide them with a pension, 9 paid holidays, and that they take some action to reduce the presence of the harmful asbestos dust. Lucky for the American owners, Duplessis was firmly on their side, and throughout the months of March and May of that year, workers clashed repeatedly with police, burning rail tracks and throwing rocks at the replacement workers brought in to keep the mine running. At the end of the strike, the workers didn't achieve much beyond a 5-cent increase to their pay, whereas the safety concerns were never addressed. What's interesting about the Asbestos Strike of 1949 today, aside from the obvious narrative of worker oppression, is the political maneuvering going on behind the scenes. Firstly, the representatives of the workers, the union that was negotiating their position, was not a socialist organization. It was instead a Catholic union. The Catholic Church was justifiably terrified of the influence of socialism throughout the world, and in Quebec, the solution was to fill the void before the socialists could get there. And on this occasion, the Catholic Church did seem to have the best interests of the workers at heart, at least at first. Monseigneur Joseph Charbonneau was very supportive of the workers, and in a sermon he gave in Montreal, he said, "The working class is the victim of a conspiracy aimed at crushing them. And when there is a conspiracy to crush the working class, it's the church's duty to intervene. We value people more than capital." Cool dude, right? He also had other church communities outside of Montreal raise funds for the families participating in the strikes and read appeals to aid the workers. Unfortunately, things didn't actually go that well for Charbonneau. And this actually leads us to that second major policy of the Duplessis government, clericalism. You see, l'Union Nationale had a tight relationship with the Catholic Church. For the most part, l'Union Nationale could count on the church to preach their position from the pulpit, and in return, they would favor policies that strengthened the position of the Catholic Church in Quebec society. In particular, the church at this time was in control of both healthcare and education, which gave them enormous social influence, aside from already representing the organizing principle of Quebec society with the church buildings themselves. Returning to the Asbestos Strike, it represented a serious challenge to Duplessis and l'Union Nationale that the Archbishop of Montreal was directly challenging the policy of the government. And so, the government flexed its muscles and its relationship with the Catholic Church. Behind the scenes, Duplessis was apparently able to have Charbonneau removed, and he was sent to British Columbia, where he would become a chaplain for the Sisters of St. Anne in Victoria up until his death. The government, when it wanted, could even have an archbishop removed. Okay, but there's maybe a happy ending to all of this? Well, kind of, actually. The Asbestos Strike of 1949 was a ways off from the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, but it represented the first crack in the facade. While the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Quebec government was never something that either side ever tried to conceal, the Asbestos Strike of 1949 showed the average Quebecer that that wasn't necessarily a good thing. And 11 years later, which is a long time, folks, l'Union Nationale would lose power to the liberal government of Jean Lesage, kicking off what we call the Quiet Revolution. On a bit of an unrelated note, if you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to like and subscribe for more of my content in the future. Okay, so, the Quiet Revolution. At its core, the movement is best summed up by the 1962 re-election campaign slogan by the Quebec Liberals, which was Maître chez nous, or Masters in our own home. Fundamentally, the Quiet Revolution is about taking back a control that was lost as far back as the conquest. And in this sense, I can imagine that the 1960s were a pretty exciting time to be a Quebecer. Maître chez nous, among other things, but in particular, meant taking back control of the power of electricity through the establishment of Hydro-Québec, what we would pronounce in English as just Hydro-Québec. This was of particular importance on a social level because at the time, most of the electricity companies were owned from outside of Quebec or by Anglophone Quebecers. You had to know English to work for the power plant. And so by nationalizing power, Quebecers were able to ensure not only a reasonable fee for electricity, but they were also able to develop a class of French-speaking engineers. Quebecers wouldn't have to be just miners or wage earners. They could now be white-collar experts as well. If the Quiet Revolution had stopped at the creation of Hydro-Québec, it would have already changed a lot, but it was only getting started. Maître chez nous was also about creating a more tolerant, open, less hierarchical, less traditionalist society. Maître chez nous was about wresting control from the Catholic Church in healthcare and in education, both of which were created during the 1960s, during the Quiet Revolution. In this way, the Quiet Revolution represented a wholesale rejection of the policies of Maurice Duplessis and l'Union Nationale. Out were economic liberalization and clericalism. In was public ownership and secularism. The Quiet Revolution created in Quebec all of the institutions of a modern democratic society, and the people were justifiably proud of what they had achieved. Anyways, how does any of this relate to the sovereignty movement? To find out, let's first take a look at René Lévesque. René Lévesque is a towering figure in the sovereignty movement. For example, he was to a great extent at the center of the Maître chez nous movement, which saw the creation of Hydro-Québec. And he was, in fact, the man who saw it through as Minister for Natural Resources during the Quiet Revolution from 1960 to 1966. Although initially an ardent liberal, Lévesque's political leanings and temperament eventually led to his breakup with the Liberal Party of Quebec. He openly sided, for example, with a group of government workers which were on strike, a no-no if you work for the government. At the head of this openly sovereigntist political party, Lévesque would go on to lead Quebec into the first of two referenda on the subject of Quebec's sovereignty. And while the motion passed by a pretty slim margin, Lévesque famously said,
Si je vous ai bien compris, vous êtes en train de dire à la prochaine fois.
If I understand you right, you're saying, until next time. Now, why do I bring up Lévesque? Well, aside from being one of the driving forces behind Quebec sovereigntism for 20 years, what he says about sovereigntism also really neatly sums up what sovereigntism meant and continues to mean for Quebecers. To show you this, I'd like to take a look at a clip from a conversation between Lévesque and some students at Scarborough College in Ontario. It's a fantastic watch, and I highly recommend watching it. Link in the description. Lévesque is a truly captivating speaker, both funny and passionate. And incidentally, I think that the fact that it took me hearing him in English to understand this gets to the reality of the miscommunication between French-speaking and English-speaking Canada. Anyways, let's take a look.
Oui, ma'am. J'ai peur que votre nouvelle Québec ne soit un mouvement d'élite. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid that the people of Quebec, the low people, the workers, will not benefit nearly as quickly as you think. And the fact that the economic development of Canada has been so dependent upon the cooperation of the United States, investments of the United States, will not extend to your new Quebec. And that you will need, you say, get rid of the 18 to 20% minority of English-speaking.
I didn't say get rid. My God.
No. You say, let's say, for example.
And I don't believe it.
Let's say, for example, that all these people leave, the people who have the money. Say, for example, they do, and they are moving out now, and you know it as well as I do, that a lot of money...
Quite a few of the people who have the money, that's right,
yes,
are leaving.
All right, okay.
And quite a few of them who are used to thinking that the natives, and I'm sorry to feel bitter because I live in Montreal. Mm-hmm. Recently, I was in a so-called non-public, one of those private affairs with young businessmen. Next to me was sitting the grandson of someone who was something or other like a lieutenant governor at the time when we were completely the natives. Next, On the other side was the nephew of Mr. McLaughlin, the president of the Royal Bank, and a few of the, all of them around the 30 or 35-year-old group, calling themselves the Whiff of Grape, very elegant little club for dinners once a month. We were discussing in private. I was trying to be very polite when one of them came up and said to me, and this was typical of the money group among that dominant minority in Montreal. He said, when you guys have finished doing what you're doing, you'll come groveling back. You know what the word means?
Yes.
Groveling back to us. Now, this was one of a few instances in the last few years that have helped me in a way you can't imagine to make damn sure that it's going to happen the way we think. And it is going to happen.
Yes.
Some of those should leave for our own health. And the quicker they leave, the better. But the low people, as to use your word, in other words, the guy that has to earn a living, and God knows there's more of them than there is of the other bunch. Mm-hmm. They're not that traumatized or, banged over the head by a possible change. I know a lot of friends in my riding who are taxi drivers, clerks in stores. Some of them are English, some of them are Jews, some of them are immigrants of other descriptions. And they say if things are done reasonably, and we are respected, and we have members among those groups in our movement right now, and they're in growing numbers. They say this might become, in spite of what I think Monsieur Desrochers was saying, a more just and a more equitable and a fairer society if it administers and develops itself than if it has this sort of irresponsibility that was going on for too long.
Yes, so
and I think this, without any guarantee, because nobody can be sure of the future, this we'd have a better chance of doing on our own than in the present setup.
What I'm afraid of...
And the low people, as you say, are more and more in agreement with that.
Yeah, well, what I'm afraid of, and I certainly agree, I'm afraid of the fact that what will happen in Quebec is what has happened in many developing countries who have separated, that a government of elite will come into power.
I don't believe it.
Will benefit from the independence in a monetary way.
My dear young lady, what you have now in Ontario and in Ottawa is a government of elite, money elite, mostly.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so on a very superficial level, this is the most passionate that Lévesque gets during his conversation. And I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but this is the only person who makes the attempt to speak to him in French. Anyways, what she is basically asking him is why Quebec wouldn't fall victim to the same cycles of violence characteristic of the dictatorships emerging in Africa through the process of decolonization, i.e. the revolving door of minorities oppressing each other, leading to further revolutions, then lather, rinse, repeat. In short, she's asking, are you sure you don't want to ethnically cleanse Quebec of Anglophones? Man, the stakes seem pretty high, right? His response is no, but it's a very prescient question, isn't it? Lévesque does think that certain people, the whiff of grape as he calls it, should leave Quebec, and maybe even Canada, I don't know. But at the end of the day, Lévesque's understanding of Quebec as it relates to Canada is as part of the project of decolonization. Quebecers are a colonized people, and independence is the only way to fix that, to heal from that. But what about the oppressors? Like seriously, what would happen if Quebec became a sovereign nation in the 1960s? For Lévesque, the answer is clear, and the Quiet Revolution is evidence for that. The Quiet Revolution was fundamentally about freeing the people of Quebec from the shackles imposed upon them by history. In this sense, I really don't think that we could imagine that the political order that emerged from the British conquest wouldn't also find itself at some point in the crosshairs of the Quiet Revolution. And so, yes, Quebecers began to think that if they were now free from the Catholic Church, which had been the religion of Quebec even before it was called Quebec, well, what about Canada? It's almost lower-hanging fruit, right? Regardless, for Quebec, it was a quiet revolution, not a bloody one. There were no priests burned. There were no guillotines erected in front of l'Assemblée Nationale. But the next step for the revolution has to be a transformation of the political order. While we can't know what would have otherwise been, the British Empire had been a big part of the stagnation of Quebec, and many Quebecers did not feel that they had honestly entered into Confederation. British Columbia chose to enter to pay off their debt. Manitoba rose in rebellion to buy itself an equal place in Confederation with blood. Even Newfoundland and Labrador joined after a referendum, which, while close, was still more than Quebecers felt they had arguably been given. In short, the Quiet Revolution proved to Quebecers that they could and should be maîtres chez nous, masters in their home. They had solved some pretty big social problems, and they weren't keen on leaving it there. Sovereignty in Quebec is often criticized as making no economic sense, but then it isn't and has never been about that. It's about self-determination. It's about bringing to life that sense of confidence that was born out of the Quiet Revolution. It's about addressing the feeling of subjection to an alien authority that came from the conquest. If today, Quebec seems to run counter in some pretty fundamental ways to the rest of Canada, it's because many people in that province see themselves that way, as fundamentally different from the rest of Canada. If it seems like Quebecers are bellyaching, even though Canada bends over backwards to accommodate them, then maybe we should consider why the country seems to need to do so. In other words, maybe it's because Quebec shouldn't be a part of Canada.